Well, what about streets that have been named after them? Well, all these streets you see in red have been named after enslavers. So we see Black Bottom, we see Paradise Valley, and many of the streets that run through those neighborhoods. And so some of the example, when you hear Brush, Elijah Brush, Adelaide Brush, the Bobians, Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson had enslaved over 600 people. John R. Williams actually has two streets named after him, John R. and Williams. He was the Free Press co-founder and former mayor. Macomb, the brothers Alexander and William. William was one of the largest slaveholders, having more than 20 enslaved within Brevard. I mean, the names go on and on and on. Very common names you all know. Many of these people enslaved others. Slavery in Detroit was paled and compared to slavery in the South. Almost 4 million people were enslaved in the South. This is a map from the U.S. Census Department, 1860, and you can see different counties. The darker the color, the higher the percentage of enslaved people. And the amazing thing is places like South Carolina actually had a higher population of enslaved people than free people. 402,000 versus 301,000 free. Mississippi, the same thing. Just incredible numbers. 32% of the people living in the South were enslaved. So we all know there was an Underground Railroad movement. That movement looked to free those who were enslaved and bring them to freedom. Many of them came through Detroit because they could go to Canada and seek freedom. Very interesting story. The 1787 Northwest Ordinance, which impacted much of the Midwest, including Michigan, actually banned new slavery. But if you had slaves, you could continue to enslave them. It didn't abolish it, so you just couldn't acquire more. Canada had a similar law. So the interesting thing, if you escaped from the United States to Canada, you would be free. And if you escaped from Canada to the United States, you would be free. Just a very fascinating set of rules that applied here and led to a lot of crossings of the border in order for people to become free. Now, when we talk about Paradise Valley, we have to realize that this is also the Jewish port of entry for Jews coming from Germany and from Eastern Germany, or Eastern Europe. First from Germany. So 1840s, German Jews started arriving in numbers. The first Jewish neighborhood in Detroit was centered around Hastings Street, right in Paradise Valley. And an article in the Free Press in 1896 described Little Jerusalem, shown here in this gold rectangle, and it pretty much covers most of Paradise Valley and Black Bottom. This timeline shows, though, a dramatic transformation over 11 years. So 1915, Paradise Valley is mostly Jewish. 1917, what's happening? World War I. United States has immigration laws to halt immigration from Europe. We don't want anybody coming here. Very, very strict. So the flow of Jews from the Pale in the Russian Empire stops. At the same time, in the South, 1915 to 1917, we have the boll weevil infestation. So all of the folks who were enslaved became shared croppers. Crops were wiped out by the boll weevil infestation. At the same time, we have manufacturing jobs. We're going into World War I, and manufacturing jobs are ramping up. So there's an attraction. All of a sudden, you have this migration. In 2-year period, 1916 to 1917, between 25,000 and 30,000 African Americans came from the South to the North, and specifically to Detroit. So by 1926, most of the Jews have left Paradise Valley, and it has transformed. And John Cohassi, a historian, shows in 1917, this was what was described as the Black Ghetto in Detroit, covering much of Paradise Valley and much of Black Bottom. So the Great Migration refers to the migration of blacks from south to the north. Over 6 million African Americans moved from the south to the north. In 1910, Detroit had 6,000 black residents. By 1970, it had 660,000. The other interesting part is the other great migration you don't really hear about, and that's the migration of whites from the south to the north. And there was a study that just came out in 2023 led by Professor Sam Bazzi and others at the University of California. They found between 1900 and 1940, about 5 million white Southerners left the region. And the interesting thing is they migrated very differently. At the top, you see the Southern whites. They came up, most of them went to rural counties, and a lot of them went out west. The darker the color, the higher percentage of Southern folks that are, in this case, Southern whites, are locating to the north. The migration of Southern blacks is shown in the bottom, and you can see they're mainly going to cities, larger cities. So a very different migration pattern. And these professors actually have a theory that the migration of Southern whites primarily to rural areas and to the west, and the way the electoral college system works, is that could have actually influenced a number of presidential elections over the last 20 years. Very, very interesting study. So black auto workers in Detroit, this is another fascinating thing to me. So Henry Ford announced his $5 a day wage in 1914. It was not available at first to black workers. So in 1917, Ford Motor had 200 black employees. By 1920, things were starting to change. 1,500 black workers. 1922, Ford had 5,300 black workers alone at the River Rouge plant, and then by 1926, over 10,000. So within a short period of time, they're in all phases of manufacturing. And it was still unique. Look at this. This is 1939 to 40. Ford has 12% of its workforce, over 10,000 black workers. Everybody else, look at this, General Motors only 2.5%, Chrysler 4%, and then you look at some of the automotive suppliers, and then Packard Motor, Hudson Motor, very small percentages. So black migrants found similar segregationist policies here that they found in the South. They faced a hostile work environment. White workers were not happy that they had to share the workplace with folks coming from the South, particularly those who were of a different color. And there were an estimated 70,000 Ku Klux Klansmen here in Detroit in the 1920s, coming from the South, thinking about that migration pattern. So when African Americans migrated north, they also brought societal changes to this mostly white city, and jazz and blues comes to Detroit. Thank God. Okay? So if you go, where does jazz and blues come from? Most people will point to Congo Square in New Orleans, 1819. So you remember Code Noir. New France went all the way down to New Orleans. As a matter of fact, after Cadillac left Detroit, he went down to New Orleans and to Louisiana to be basically the effective governor of Louisiana. So enslaved persons, according to Code Noir, had Sundays off. So they would gather at Congo Square. You would get the mix of West Indies, African beats mixed with the influences from Southern Baptist churches, all of those different sounds coming together. And that became the foundation for what became jazz and blues. So the peak of the Great Migration happened to coincide with the evolution of jazz that occurred in this country during the same era. So we were dry here in Michigan for 15 years, all the way up until 1933. In fact, Prohibition started here 2 years before it started in the rest of the United States. So after that, all of a sudden, boom, we've got an opportunity for all these jazz and blues clubs to just take off. So we know, most of us know Baker's Keyboard Lounge, considered to be the oldest jazz club in the country. Started in 1934. The Bluebird Inn, which actually is still standing and is being renovated and hopefully will open again. The Detroit Sound Conservancy is leading that. That was a black-owned club. That was like the Players Club, where the players really like to play. And then Club Congo was in the Norwood Hotel on East Adams, right near St. Antoine, right where Ford Field is today. And there you had Howard McGee on the right here. He was a Detroiter, and you have Thelonious Monk here on the left. And Howard McGee would play with all the bebop legends. So bebop emerged as a style of jazz in the 1940s as well. You had Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker leading the way. And Detroit was right in there. The El Club, right on St. Antoine, south of Adams, had just this magical first year. It started off with Dizzy Gillespie opening. Later on, you had Charlie Parker doing a 2-week stint. And it was hailed as this incredible fusion of the new jazz movement, and Detroit was part of it. And then look at these ads. Dizzy Gillespie, June 1947, Charlie Parker, Arnett Cobb, all playing at this club that had just opened in 1947. And so, once again, I like to make maps. So I mapped where all the jazz and blues clubs were during this time. And you can see they're all over. You have Black Bottom, Paradise Valley. Here's the Sugar Hill District. Canfield and John R. was another major concentration. And then this is Hastings Street up and down here. Okay? So this was an incredible concentration. In fact, you could say that the concentration has been compared to what you currently have in Austin, Texas today in the entertainment district. Another club that should be mentioned is the Flame Show Bar. This was near Canfield and John R. John R. was considered the street of music, and this is the club where you may say Motown was born, because Berry Gordy had very strong connections here. His sisters had the photo and cigarette concessions at this club. Barry came here. He met a talent agent named Al Green, who introduced him to Jackie Wilson. He ended up writing songs for Jackie Wilson, including Lonely Teardrops, which became a top 10 hit. He used that money and loans from the family to start Tamla Records, which then became Motown. And then the band members, the house band here at the Flame Show Bar, they ended up becoming part of the Funk Brothers, and also, you had some of them became producers, like the musical director for Motown was Maurice King. He was in the band. Thomas Bean Bowles, later musical director for Smokey Robertson, and he played the sax on Heat Wave and Baby Love. I mean, these are all guys that were part of this band here in this small club at John R. and Canfield, and this was really part of the birth of Motown. And look at the people who played at the Flame. You got Nina Simone, 1960, Sam Cooke, Billie Holiday, 1957, Della Reese, B.B. King, and then Aretha Franklin did a 10-day stint in 1963, which was really probably, I think, her first club appearance ever, and really helped to launch her career. And the interesting thing about her is, as I mentioned, her father's church was, you could walk from the Flame Show Bar. It was right at 4210 Hastings Street. So Hastings Street was a major corridor of commerce, the heartbeat of Paradise Valley and Black Bottom. It stretched over 100 city blocks from the Detroit River all the way to East Grand Boulevard. And Hastings Street was the home of blues. I mentioned Joe's Records. So here's Joe's record shop. This is Joe Von Battle here, and you can see he was recording all of C.L. Franklin's sermons. So he would go up the street to the New Bethel Baptist Church and record his sermons, cut them as records, and sell them. This is the Forest Club, which is, you can see Joe's Records is there. Just up the street is the Forest Club. Forest Club was fascinating, one of the largest clubs in the city. It had the longest bar in Detroit. It was 107 feet long. It had a bowling alley. It was like an entertainment venue right at Forest and Hastings Street. And just look at this ad, Lionel Hampton playing at the Forest Club. This is from December 1947. On Christmas Eve, his show starts at 11 p.m., goes to 4 a.m. It says, bring your Christmas presents. I mean, you go to church, head over there, and spend the night at the Forest Club, right? So this kind of compares, I mentioned the density. There were 30 venues per square mile of jazz and blues clubs in this area of Detroit. Just incredible. So Paradise Valley was an incubator for black-owned businesses. This is a look at Hastings Street looking from the Brewster Douglas projects north. You can see this is Sacred Heart, the spire all the way over on the right on Elliott Street. This is Hastings Street. Really good view of it. Several churches supported the Underground Railroad movement, and one of them that I'd like to talk about is the Second Baptist Church on Monroe Street, right in Greektown, right at Beaubien. It's on the right-hand side as you look at this photograph. You can see the new Hudson Tower in the back. This was organized in March 1836 by 14 former enslaved persons. They were part of the First Baptist Church and found that they were facing discrimination and oppression there. So they decided to start their church. This is the oldest black church in Michigan and the oldest black church in the Midwest. And it became a critical part of the Underground Railroad movement, helping enslaved people to reach Canada. The second black church in Paradise Valley and in Detroit, as a matter of fact, was the Bethel AME Church. This was another very important church. So this church was organized in 1941 and established at the corner of Napoleon and Hastings in 1889. It was the first to really become active in social services. And if you look at this photo, you can see they actually had a social service annex right here next to the main church. They helped people find jobs, helped people get other social services that were needed. And that advanced. They became so popular they had to move. So they moved up to the corner of Frederick and St. Antoine. And once they made that move, a couple years later, the Reverend William Peck assumed leadership. And he founded what was called the Booker T. Washington Trade Association. And his wife, Fanny, founded the Housewives Club. And they ended up using that platform to create a directory of black-owned businesses that came out every year. And they would host training workshops, all intended to drive people to shop and patronize black-owned businesses. So this is a fascinating map. Hastings Street, St. Antoine, this is Napoleon. Look at this. This is 1921 Sanborn map. Look at all these Jewish congregations. There's 7 congregations of Jewish faith here. You have the Bishop Union School. This was part of the public school system. Notoriously, the Purple Gang met here. The Jewish organized crime family met at the Bishop Union School. And then right in the center, you can see where Bethel AME Church is. So you have this mix of all these different religions here. And wouldn't it be fascinating to go visit these places? Well, you can't. They're gone. The freeway interchange has taken all of that out. So I became really interested when I read this article. I was doing a newspaper search and I came across this article from the Free Press in 1952 talking about the number of black-owned businesses. Over 2,500 black-owned businesses in 1952. This is about the time Detroit's population is reaching its peak, over 1.8 million people. This was it. This was the peak. And I kept researching and I found another article from the next year referring to the 1952 Booker T. Washington Trade Association directory. And it claimed that Detroit had more black-owned businesses than any city in the country. And I said, wow, so where were they? What kind of businesses were they? To my knowledge, I started asking around. No one had ever mapped them. No one had ever really documented them. And I was very fortunate at the Detroit Public Library at the Burton Collection to come across there were actually just 2 examples of the Booker T. Washington Trade Association, one from the 1930s, but then they had the one from 1952. I don't think anybody had touched it since 1952. I then took that and took on a mapping project. This took me about 6 months to do, going through, documenting, putting them into a spreadsheet. Then I wanted to map them within my study area here. So this is my study area, and this is a 1946 base map. So when we look here, we can see this is Hastings Street. So this is where I-75 would be now. This is where I-94 would be. This is the DeQuinder Cut. This is Gratiot, Black Bottom, Paradise Valley. So you can see this concentration of businesses. So Black Bottom had 60 black-owned businesses at least. This is, of course, the minimums. Paradise Valley, over 310 black-owned businesses. The Medical Center, West Brush Park, 272, and then the Cultural Center, 200. So a total of 842 black-owned businesses at least, with 167 of them having a Hastings Street address. So you see the power of Hastings Street. And it's interesting, most of these places are gone, but one survives, and this was actually at the corner of Broadway and Gratiot. This building still survives, and it had more black-owned businesses than any other. It had 27 black-owned businesses in 1952, and including notable judges. Damon Keith had his office here. So this was 9% of the overall Paradise Valley black-owned businesses were in this one building. This was the Breitmeyer-Tobin building. Former Mayor Breitmeyer owned this building. He was a florist. He ultimately founded FTD Florist. So this is Lower Paradise Valley. You can see this is where Ford Field is right now. Whoops, sorry. Ford Field, you can see right there on the left-hand side, kind of faded out. Adams Street, Elizabeth Street, Columbia Street, Hastings Street, all those streets are gone now. They've been cleared out because of the construction of the entertainment. But look at all these jazz and blues clubs concentrated right here, just within walking distance at the intersection, from the intersection of St. Antoine and Adams. And then look at the black-owned businesses. They were also concentrated here. So if we continue with our street network, we've got Adams, we've got Columbia, and then up at the top, East Verner Highway, where the Fisher Freeway is now. That was East Verner Highway. That was also a concentration of black-owned businesses. And so when we look at Ford Field and Comerica Park, there were at least 10 black-owned businesses where Comerica Park is now. There were at least 56 black-owned businesses on the Ford Field site. Some examples included the Fairburn Hotel. So when you're looking at third base at Comerica Park, that's where the Fairburn Hotel was approximately. This was an 8-story, 450 room hotel. It was a stag hotel for single black men only. Then you had the Lucy Thurman YWCA right where the eastern edge of Ford Field is today. This was a cultural and recreational hub in the Paradise Valley neighborhood. In Black Bottom, we also had a number of businesses. These businesses were different, though. Black Bottom was mostly a residential area. The businesses that were here were really catering to the neighborhood. So beauty shops, salons, corner markets, much lower scale in terms of intensity than the businesses you found in Paradise Valley. And then when you listen to the accounts of people who lived here and you read about them, it's really interesting. So for example, here's one from a Free Press article in 1998. There wasn't any major crime, recalls Fred Williams, whose first assignment with the Detroit Police Department was walking the beat in Black Bottom. The neighbors kept watch over you, said Roberta Hughes Wright. Anything you might do that didn't seem quite right, the neighbors were right on you. This was in contrast to Paradise Valley. Paradise Valley was more intense. It had an edge to it, more prostitution, more gambling. The neighborhood of Black Bottom, though, much more solidified, a much more cohesive, important neighborhood. So I also wanted to learn about the population in the Black Bottom neighborhood. So I looked at the census tracts from 1950. There were really 4 census tracts that covered Black Bottom. It's a little bit bigger than the boundary, but it's pretty close. So this was Black Bottom boundary. The census tracts go a little farther towards the river. But here's the breakdown. You can see that in some areas you have much higher black percentage population. In the lower corner here, closer to where Greektown is, you had more of a mix of different ethnic backgrounds. But look at the data. You had about 14,000 people in all of these, 2,800 dwelling units. 74% of the dwelling units were built before 1919. This is older housing stock. 51% had no running water, 59% no private bath. But let's compare this to Corktown. Corktown's really the oldest neighborhood, considered to be the oldest neighborhood, right? Very similar conditions, except the structures are actually older here. 99% were built in 1919 or older. 24% of these homes had no running water. 47% had no private bath. But 89% white, 11% black. So a white neighborhood versus a black neighborhood, but very similar conditions. And when you look at the homes, this is an example of a home in Black Bottom. Wood frame, fairly attractive, but virtually no insulation. It was cold in the winter, it was hot in the summer. But this is a modern Google Street View of Corktown. Look at these homes, wood frame. These survived, even though there was a lot of development that occurred, primarily industrial development in the Corktown area. These survived. This was mainly a white neighborhood. So let's say you were successful in Paradise Valley. You had a business, you lived in Black Bottom, and you want to move to someplace better for your family, right? You want to go somewhere else in Detroit. So you start looking at the ads in the paper. How about Brightmoor? Here's a new neighborhood coming into Detroit, the Brightmoor neighborhood. Here's 6 great reasons why you should buy now. Number 4, 100% white American people, English-speaking, enthusiastic, proud of Brightmoor, friendly neighbors with children of the kind you want your children to play with. All right, so now let's look to Oakland County. Maybe I can do better there if I'm looking. Bloomfield Village. This is the answer to your neighborhood problem. City neighborhoods are changing rapidly, so do neighbors. The intermingling of mixed creeds, nationalities, even races inevitably follows spreading commercial areas in once desirable city neighborhoods. Bloomfield Hills, where exclusiveness endures. So you could see your choices were very limited if you were an African American in the city of Detroit in terms of where you could live. Now, the 1940s was a time of increased racial tension. This is really an incredible timeline to me as I read it. So we have an executive order by, there's been a lot of executive orders lately. This one's a good one. Executive order, Franklin Roosevelt opens the door for African Americans to work in manufacturing plants. Okay, we're going into World War I, we need more workers, and Ford seemed to be the only one that wanted to hire anybody of color. That opened the door to more workers of all ethnicities working in the auto industry and in the manufacturing industry. Then in 1942, violent protests by white mobs erupt as black families first moved into the Sojourner Truth Housing Project. Fascinating story. This was a housing project originally desired for black residents. There was an uprising by whites and complaints, and in the House Appropriations Committee, they were trying to get the funding changed so it would only be whites. Eleanor Roosevelt steps in, convinces her husband and Mayor Jeffries of Detroit to make it a development for black population. A lot of black veterans were to live there. So it continued. White mobs broke out as soon as black people tried to move here. So a lot of tense situation there. And then between 41 and 44, you had these wildcat hate strikes by a lot of the manufacturing plants. Black workers are being added to the workforce. The white workforce is not happy at all. Then in 1943, the Detroit Housing Commission adopts a segregation policy. Public housing built in black neighborhoods will be black only, and white tenants will only be allowed in white neighborhoods. This policy lasted until 1952, segregation by policy. Then in 1943, Detroit has its 3-day riot. This was a race riot, started with fights between blacks and whites on Belle Isle. Then there was a rumor about a baby being thrown over a bridge on Belle Isle, and that was at the Forest Club, ironically. Someone got on the stage and said, there's stuff going on down at Belle Isle. That sparked rioting up and down Hastings Street, and federal troops had to be called in to calm things down. But that caused a lot of damage to Paradise Valley. So lo and behold, the next year, New York developer Eugene Greenhut proposes a $50 million slum clearance plan for Black Bottom. New housing would be proposed. Edward Jeffries, the mayor, convinces the Common Council of Detroit to adopt the plan. Then in 1949, there's some magical funding that appears from the federal government. You've got the 1949 Housing Act, and President Truman and Congress make millions available for slum clearance. This is coming at a time when Detroit is in the middle of a housing crisis. 1949, Mayor Eugene Antwerp says there are 37,000 families in Detroit living 2 to 3 families in one unit. Okay, imagine that, 2 to 3 families all gathering in one unit because they don't have choices. 8,000 families are on the waiting list for low rent housing. So what do we do over the next few years? When Mayor Cobo comes in 1950, we go and we destroy one of the largest black neighborhoods. Black Bottom is essentially cleared and demolished. The homes of almost 8,000 people were condemned. Over 90% of them are renters, which means they receive no compensation and little to no assistance with relocation. Another great book, Redevelopment and Race by Professor June Manning Thomas from the University of Michigan. She noted in her book, builders constructed 178,000 homes in the Detroit suburbs between 1950 and 1956. 750 of these were available to non-whites. And the white population outflow from the city of Detroit started in the 1950s. I don't know how many times you might hear somebody say it all started in 1967. That is not true. The outflow started because they could. There were homes being built in the suburbs that were available, and for the most part, only white people could move to those homes. Whites were leaving Detroit at a pace of 22,000 per year in the mid-1960s. You had the Federal Housing Administration, had the 10% down, 31-year mortgage, encouraging people to move to new homes. The federal government was encouraging suburban development, but it wasn't available to everyone. So moving was a national trend from the city to the suburbs. If you look at the 10 largest cities in the United States, only New York and Los Angeles had higher populations from 1950 to 2020. All the others saw a decline. It was a trend to move to the suburbs. Everyone wanted to do it. So the next blow to Paradise Valley and Black Bottom is the freeways. So in 1944, the top post-war priority for the city of Detroit was a system of freeways and wider roadways. So Detroit publishes a new master plan in '51 calling for a freeway system. Congress passes the money, the Federal Aid Highway Act, 1956. And then we see I-75 and I-375 constructed in the early 1960s. Hastings Street is gone. About 97 of the 100 blocks are destroyed as part of this process. So here's the 1951 master plan. You can see I-75 was called the Hastings-Oakland Expressway. And here's where 375 is. This was all on the plan. And then also they had redevelopment areas. These redevelopment areas, Black Bottom, Brewster Douglas in Paradise Valley, and then Corktown. This was to be industrial. This is south of Michigan Avenue. So look at these aerial photographs from DTE. This is 1949. Everything's pretty much intact. You can see the Brewster housing projects here, Eastern Market's over here. Here's Black Bottom, a nice grid network here with dense housing, your business concentration up here in Paradise Valley. Here's Grand Circus Park. 1956, Black Bottom is almost gone. Just wiped off the face of the earth, cleared for new development. Here are your Eastern Market sheds. Brewster Douglas. Now Brewster housing is expanded to include the Douglas Towers. They're all in place now. Here's Hastings Street. If you lived here, this was a great place to be when it initially opened. You're in the middle of the neighborhood. You can walk to Eastern Market. You can walk down to Paradise Valley. You've got Verner Highway with all these black-owned businesses here. What a great location. 1961. I-375 is under construction. Lafayette Park is starting construction. I-75 is starting construction. Hastings Street is being removed. And then by 1997, here's the whole freeway system. Look at this, Brewster Douglas, originally in the middle of a neighborhood, now has a freeway on two sides. And then this is right about the time, about 2 years before Comerica Park starts construction. So you can see what that looks like. But substantial damage to what was Paradise Valley and Black Bottom. And this map comes from Detroit Future City. You can see the boundaries of Paradise Valley and Black Bottom. The red areas are urban renewal areas. The blue areas are freeway areas. So if you're a government and your number one goal is to remove as many black residents and black businesses as possible, you've been pretty successful. And here's our photo we saw earlier. Hastings Street, this is afterwards. This is 1959, this is 1961. Hastings Street is gone, and we have a freeway. In 1958, Wayne County Road Commissioner predicted little difficulty experienced for families because of displacement of highway construction, even though these families only received a 30-day notice to leave. And it got worse if you were looking to stay in this area. The Detroit Medical Center plan was approved in 1958. It was considered a model for institutional planning, but over 3,400 families were displaced by that plan. And remember the mapping I did of black-owned businesses? These black-owned businesses were here. Over 200 of them were displaced. So they're saying that 1/3 of the Gratiot area families, so that's the Black Bottom area where Lafayette Park went, eventually moved to public housing. But 35% of these families could not be traced. The best informed city officials believe the majority of them moved within a mile, crowding into already decaying part of the city. Houses were not available. So what we ended up with urban renewal and freeway construction, we eliminated blight, but we severely damaged the social fabric of black neighborhoods, displacing people to scattered location, causing overcrowding. We created opportunities for developers to start with a clean slate, clearing out land. We destroyed hundreds of black-owned businesses and impacted the transfer of wealth from generation to generation in black communities. New freeways initially reduced travel time to and from the suburbs, but when we built those freeways, we were essentially giving people a way to leave the city, right? We were building these suburbs. They were being built at the time when people were moving to the suburbs. So this happened all over. Freeway construction impacting black communities, Chicago, St. Paul, Minnesota, Pittsburgh, Miami, Flint, Cincinnati, over and over the same story. So by understanding what's lost, what people experienced and why it happened, we gained some perspective. So I'm going to close. Well, I've got 2 slides left. This one is Brush Street between Comerica Park and Ford Field. And I'd like for you to remember when you're here at a game or at an event that this was hallowed ground for black-owned businesses. Standing here, you could easily walk to over 100 black-owned businesses in 1952. You could walk a couple blocks over and see Dizzy Gillespie or Charlie Parker play at a club in the 1940s. And then this final image I took at the corner of Hastings and Paquette, because this is one of the few places in the city of Detroit where you can find a Hastings Street sign, because there's only 3 blocks remaining. And this is the Fisher Body 21 plant, which is miraculously being renovated into residential lofts. So this inspired me to write a poem, and I want to close by reading that. It's called Only 3 Blocks Remain. Only 3 blocks remain. Once 100 or more were there. 3 fragments like pages ripped from the others, connections severed by one massive freeway, over 90 blocks torn away by another. Hundreds of black-owned shops once lined these streets, each window gleaming with dreams and enterprise. People strolling, shopping, living in this place. This street had hustle. This street was alive. New Bethel held Reverend Franklin's sermons strong. Joe's records laying down tracks of blues. Aretha's voice ascending into heaven, captured here first, before the rest of the world knew. Now 3 blocks stand where hundreds once were. These souls, footsteps, and echoes of another time. Hastings Street pulsing like a mighty vein through Detroit's soulful heart, so sublime. Only 3 blocks remain, the rest were destroyed. Callous hearts chose paths of expedience. Lives and neighborhoods changed forever, sparking sorrow, rage, and civil disobedience. As this place of history evolves and changes, as days separating us increase in number, what choices will be made for reconciliation, to seek honor and repair, or to put asunder? I thank you for your time. This is a link to my website. A lot of this information is here and available for free. It's city-photos.com. You can link to it there if you want to learn more. But thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
So grateful. You know, when we look at the types of problems that we are trying through the work we're doing with literacy, when we go to work on a housing project, I'm just really grateful because you have given us, you've just opened up the problem so that we can understand better why it is so difficult to overcome these issues.
Yes.
And so when we're, working with kids down at Karstens, I think we need to remember the vibrancy that their grandparents and great-grandparents had known, that these problems are not permanent.
They don't have to be.
They don't have to be. And just to think that we are playing our part, but there's always more to be done. And this is super helpful. How many people grew up in the Detroit area? or had their families from here. Did you hear like part of your story? Yeah, my parents are both from Detroit, and I remember well, my grandparents on both sides of the family moved to Allen Park in the 50s to live in a brand new house. And that's part of your story.
It is. The federal government basically subsidized people moving to the suburbs and made it easy and had federally backed loans and low down payment and encouraged that development to happen. And it just wasn't available to everyone.
Do you have time for a few questions?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
I know there's talk about tearing down 375, right? Can you
Rebuilding it.
rebuild, can you let us know what the talk is around
Sure,
that?
sure. In fact, I just spoke Tuesday night at the Wright Museum of African American History and I was on a panel, and it was sponsored by MDOT regarding the I-375 project. What is being proposed is, as you now know, it's a depressed freeway below the ground. The proposal is to raise it up to street level and turn it into a boulevard that will no longer be a freeway. So there will be pedestrian crossings, there will be traffic signals, you'll be stopping just like any other roadway. There's still a lot of controversy in terms of how big that roadway should really be, how many lanes it should have. Right now, it's going to be a very wide boulevard with 6 moving lanes, 3 in each direction, plus turn lanes. So it's still a fairly wide footprint. But there will likely be 30 to 40 acres left over. Typically, when MDOT acquires land or it owns land and it no longer needs it, it sells it to the highest bidder on the marketplace. In this case, they're doing something different. They are looking for a way to try to address what happened in the past. And what happens to that 40 acres, we don't really know yet what that's going to be, but that's part of the process that's ongoing now, some of the listening sessions that are happening, some of the studies in terms of what can be done to try to address the harm that was done when those freeways were put in. Obviously, 40 acres is just 40 acres, right? You can only do so much, but hopefully it's a start. The other thing that's happening is MDOT is proposing to cap parts of I-75 right along where Little Caesars Arena is. You know how the freeway comes along through there. And they're proposing 3 caps, one at Brush, one at Woodward, and one over closer to Cass. It's all conceptual, but these would be wide areas, couple blocks long, that would go over the freeway and would be like a park setting, and they're trying to figure out how that should be programmed. I went to one of the meetings and I told them about my research, and I said, particularly for the Brush Street one, because it connects to this area, I said, you have to have this history included. There should be historical markers. There should be ways for when people are walking to Ford Field or Comerica Park and they're going through here, they should be able to learn about this, because this is important history, and there needs to be ways to channel that so people understand it. And it's one of my goals with this presentation, and I'm thinking about potentially even writing a book that would be geared towards high school, middle school. This isn't taught in schools. I never learned about this, and I don't think many people do. And everyone should know this story, just because it's part of our history, and it can inform how we might think about things in the future and how we might react to certain things that are happening. And I just feel like it's important. So, yes. Yes, so the Burwood Wall.
What was the question?
Can I talk about the Burwood Wall? Okay, so that was The Federal Housing Administration had a policy that they're not going to loan you money if you are a black person trying to move into a white neighborhood or a white person trying to move into a black neighborhood. Okay, that was part of the policy. It was written, federal government, we're not going, there was a concept called, you've all heard about redlining, where we would identify certain areas of a city that were considered to be at high risk. And they would be colored red on the map, and generally no loans would be granted there. Well, in the case of the Burwood Wall, there was a proposal for a development that would have basically violated that, and they required the developer to build a wall between the black neighborhood and the white neighborhood in order to provide for separation so that it wouldn't be a violation. Yes, 6 feet high wall. Yes.
Where did it run?
It's been decorated. Yeah, it's in northwest.
It's just south of 8 Mile.
Right. Yeah.
Lisa, and
And I know
then,
you had one over there too. So.
How did these two areas get their names?
Good question. Black Bottom, the predominant theory is that Black Bottom was named by the French because of the soil that was there. It had this dark, rich, humus soil, and so that there was a name. There's some theories that maybe that wasn't it, but I think the predominant body of knowledge is that the French named it for the soil. Paradise Valley got its name through a contest of naming the area, and I think the fact that you had the influence of the Paradise Theater, which is now Orchestra Hall, probably had some impact on that. But yeah, that was named by a contest.
Mary.
With your professional affiliations and teachings and so forth, are you seeing a shift in a greater appreciation and perhaps effort to meet the ethics regarding planning, what it means, how it changes things? There are a lot of lessons to be learned here, and there's a thought to kind of undo some of the damage. But there's urban planning and so forth going on all the time, all over the place. I just came back from Florida. It looks like you poured water on the desert and it just exploded. There's always damage done. It's just a matter of choices and things. Are you seeing a shift in how professionals view that and a greater appreciation through what had previously been massive disregard for those concerns?
I think younger planners coming out of school are getting exposed to more of these types of historical lessons, and I think the ethical components might sit with some of them, but I can't say that it's 100% embraced across the country. And the problem is so much of what happens with development is fueled by dollars. And to do things right, like if you took, let's say you took the stand that removing Black Bottom was the right thing to do, and I'm not saying it was. So let's take it down one path. That this was an area that needed to be, the homes were outdated. It was going to be very difficult to rehab them all. It needed to be removed. If you were accepting that, then the right thing to do would have been to make sure that you had a place where those folks could either be reincorporated into a new neighborhood there, which would be ideal because they stay there and keep the neighborhood cohesiveness, and open it up maybe so it would have a wide variety of residents, or have a relocation process that made some sense so that they had a place to go to establish a new neighborhood somewhere else. That costs money, and no one was willing, that was not in the federal appropriations to do something like that. So when you were getting housing money or you were getting freeway money, no one wanted to pay. This was already massive expenditures. No one's usually willing to pay that extra cost to do things the right way. And so you have to decide as a society, do you go ahead and do it anyway, or do you not do it? And then there could be negative impacts to your community to not doing it. So it's very complicated and very difficult to do. But to your point, yes, I think it's resonating with some people, but I don't think necessarily everyone in the profession And even if you're a planner, you're not the decision maker. You are an influencer. You're trying to convince your communities, but the planners are there to advise. It's the city councils and the mayors and those who are in authority that are actually making the decisions. And many times they don't listen to what the planners say, and they go with what the dollars say or what others say, or they might be influenced by developers. A lot of that happens too.
Seems pretty short-sighted.
Well,
I mean, it seems like if you had, the ability to see what the world would have been like if they had taken the time and the money to keep people in that neighborhood, what would the economic gain be today? I mean, it always, to me, seems like that the moral decision is also the best economic decision.
well, and you look at the bigger picture. If the African-American community was treated right at this time, would we have had a 1967 uprising? We may not have. Okay, when you look at all those things, all those various events I talked about leading up to what happened, and then we continue to fast forward to 1967, what changes could have been made so that folks who lived here didn't feel that they were not heard and were forced to just uprise? What other decisions might have been made? This is I think that was a culmination of years and years and years of oppression, racism, and neglect. And so that could have changed. And imagine if that didn't happen, what would Detroit look like now too? I mean, these are all actions that have consequences, right?
What do you think about I've only experienced a little bit of it, the Isle of Fashion and that whole Livernois area, which seems to be more locally developed or small business developed. What do you think about how that's going? And
I think it's definitely a positive step forward from what it was. There's been a lot of infrastructure improvements, rebuilding the roadway, streetscape improvements. I think some of the businesses are doing well. Some have come and gone. It's a mix, like anything else. It's a tough economy, but it's a step in the right direction.
I mean, I was there, and then 10 years later there, and for me it was a big difference. I was at Tech Town, and we had a number of clients that had small businesses going up there, so that's what took me there. And it seemed like it was going in the right direction. Let's put it that way.
Yeah,
but I don't
I
know
would
how
agree.
it is today. I haven't been back.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't spent a lot of time there, and I visited there more probably 5 to 10 years ago. I haven't spent a whole lot of time there recently.
Well, thank you again.
Thank you.
We're so grateful. And you've been back for like 2 days.
Yeah, got back on Monday from New Zealand. Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Oh, okay, 5 days or 6 days. But
I gave this presentation Tuesday.
Yeah,
and
see,
then, but so yeah, it was,
came
it was
back hitting the
boom,
ground
right in,
running.
so I was ready
Yeah,
to go.
well, we're really appreciative of that.
Yeah,
Thank
my
you.
pleasure. It was a pleasure to share the information. Thank you.